Oops. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jason Logan, and I'm the exhibitions curator here at the Logan Center. I'm really thrilled that you're able to join us this evening, and hopefully for the rest of the weekend, as we embark on a wide-ranging exploration of Pan-Africanism and its impact on the arts and culture of Chicago. Tonight's event is part of Returns, which is the first convening in a multi-year research project and public program and online platform entitled The Ties That Bind, Waves of Pan-Africanism in Contemporary Art and Society. And over the next few days, we'll host conversations that unpack the different meanings and uses of the term Pan-Africanism across the diaspora, look into ideas spearheaded by prominent scholars such as Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, Kwame Nkrumah, and Leopold Senghor. And we will have a particular focus on activities in Chicago. We will explore the trends of Afrocentrism in artistic practices and social movements in the city from the 1960s through to the 70s, alongside reflections of global Pan-African cultural festivals of the era, including Festac 77, which this year celebrates its 40th anniversary. And you can find out more about what we have coming up in the program booklet, which you should all have with you, as well as by visiting our website, tiesthatbind.uchicago.edu. And before introducing our esteemed speaker for tonight, I really want to acknowledge our supporters who have made this project possible. We're indebted to the Warhol Foundation and the Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts for supporting the Ties That Bind through their Cultural Fellowship Program. And we also extend thanks to the VIA Art Fund for providing support through their incubator grant. Additional support for Returns has also been provided by the France Chicago Center here at the University of Chicago. And I would also like to acknowledge our partners across the university and the city, including the Black Arts Initiative at Northwestern University, the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and Rebuild Foundation for supporting this specific convening. And really, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Abdul Al-Kalimat, who will present a talk entitled Chicago's Africa, Identity, Scholarship, and Politics. Following the talk, we'll open up to conversations. He'll speak for about 30 minutes or so. Please do bear in mind that we're recording tonight, and there'll be a roving mic for questions afterwards. Please do put your phones on silent as well. The hope of this kind of first conversation and talk is that we kind of collectively share our knowledge about Chicago and its kind of role in the Pan-Africanist movement. And so I encourage you, once we get to that portion of the evening, to kind of share all that you have with us and really be encouraged to ask questions and keep the conversation going. I should also mention that right after this, at around 8 o'clock, we have a blues festival, which is starting this evening and which will run all through the weekend. So if you guys are keen to kind of continue the music celebration and get dancing a little, then please do join us at 8 p.m. For a performance in the performance hall. And we have some tickets outside which are free, but we can also provide some complimentary tickets as well if you haven't picked that up too. And so Abdul Al-Kalimat is one of the founders of the field of Black Studies and author of many books and papers about Black liberation. He wrote the first college textbook, Introduction to Afro-American Studies, which has seen 7 editions, the last one free and online. A lifelong scholar activist with a PhD from the University of Chicago, he has lectured, taught, and directed academic programs across the US, the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and China. 2 of his early contributions were serving as chair of the Chicago chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and co-founding the Organization of Black American Culture, OBAC, in 1967. He was an executive committee member of the African Liberation Support Committee and a founder of the Black Radical Congress. He was the North American coordinator for the 7th Pan-African Congress held in Uganda in 1994. He was raised in Chicago's Cabrini row houses, and he is now Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abdul Al-Kalimat.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Isomi for inviting me to give this talk, as well as, of course, all our other colleagues. There are so many others who have the experience and knowledge to give this talk that it is with a great sense of responsibility that I stand here to represent them as well as myself. I want to dedicate this talk to the children of the African diaspora. What we do for ourselves is always in preparation for the generations to come. We leave a legacy for them to stand on. So my hope is that this talk will contain some nuggets of information and rational reflection on what it means to be a son or daughter of Africa spread throughout the world, infusing the cultural magic of Africa's gifts to the world. Now my focus is especially on what I am calling Chicago's Africa. Now, there's a great historical background to what I will be discussing. So just to mention a couple of important organizations that were based in Chicago that promoted various flavors of Pan-Africanism. In 1920, the UNIA, United Negro Improvement Association of Marcus Garvey, was based in Division 23, which had 20,000 members. Chicago, making it the second largest division in the UNIA in the world. In 1930, the Moorish Science Temple, led by Noble Drew Ali, had 10,000 dues-paying members in Chicago. And the peace movement of Ethiopia, whose program advocated repatriation to Liberia in 1933, gathered 400,000 signatures throughout the country for its program. Indeed, there have always been people in Chicago who were Africa-oriented. So in Chicago, we have a story to tell. I bring some experience to this assignment, including extensive travel on the continent of Africa and throughout the African diaspora. It has been my honor and responsibility to represent the African American people on several occasions during important events in Africa. I was one of 3 African Americans to speak at the International Symposium of Feshtak in 1977 in Nigeria. I was the North American coordinator of the 7th Pan-African Congress in Uganda in 1994. On the struggle side, I served on the executive committee of the African Liberation Support Committee during the 1970s and 80s, marching here in Chicago for anti-colonial liberation, to end the selling of the blood-soaked Krugerrand coin, and to free Nelson Mandela. And finally, I remained a senior fellow at Commonwealth Hall at the University of Ghana in Legon. Connie Cullen asked, what is Africa to me? And we answered, the continent that must be free. And for that, we extend the freedom mandate to all of the African diaspora, including Chicago. Now, in these brief remarks, I want to combine general theoretical reflections with specific reference to individuals and organizations who have performed Africa right here in Chicago. What I mean by this is that they can't let words get in the way. For the African Americans are an African people, but also part of the Americas. Now, the term African is an abstraction that covers many specific experiences, including the countries defined by the European exploiters at the 1884 Berlin Conference, within which there is the organic cultural diversity that evolved historically on the African continent. At the highest level of abstraction, we can say that all of humanity has an African origin, but my specific focus in this talk is Chicago's Africa, specifically Black people in Chicago. So we'll give this talk in 4 parts, as you can see. We need to address 3 key contradictions in order to fully interrogate the concept of return. First, retention versus memory. When we say that Black people in Chicago are an African people, we have to contrast the objectivity of their being, their experience, with their subjective consciousness, who they think they are, or historically, who they remember they are. In the everyday life of Black people, traces of Africa live through language and speech patterns, food, styles of performing religion. clothing and hair aesthetics, and certainly musical forms and content, beginning with the syncopation of the drum. As shown in this slide, there were some rituals and cultural practices that continued in the Americas. But colonization, especially the negation of humanity, forced on black people during slavery, both defined a universal experience of Africans as oppressed people, but also demonically negated African identity by its representation of Africa in the most negative category as a continent with no enduring contribution to human civilization and culture. For these reasons, most African Americans in the African diaspora were African but didn't know it, or certainly didn't want to admit it. Of course, this wasn't universally true, even from the beginning, as we learned from Roots by Alex Haley, or the church naming itself the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and in so many other ways. Within the concept of return, there is also the contradiction between replication versus imagination. Trying to rescue something versus thinking up something new. As I've mentioned, there is a great diversity to the African experience, making what is universally African quite an abstraction. When making a conscious choice to connect with Africa, a common choice is often with personal names. Now here we have the day names of the Akan people of Ghana, and many African Americans have chosen this particularity, while many Africans in Ghana have chosen Western names for their children. But usually there, of course, they have these Western names and indigenous African names as well. Of course, this can also be seen in hairstyles. As African stylists who have migrated to the United States from the African continent offer traditional hairstyles from diverse cultures. You can go to a salon in Brooklyn and they say, I want an African hairstyle. They say, well, what country or what group do you want? And we got a sister here from that place who do that kind of hairstyle. On the other hand, outside of hair care establishments in cities on the African continent, you often see paintings of hairstyles worn by African Americans. You want your hair cut like Jane Brown or somebody else. So in other words, replication takes place throughout the African diaspora. Everybody learning from everybody else. On the other hand, there is an imagined all-African culture being created alongside replication of traditional culture throughout the African diaspora. A good example of this is Kwanzaa. It posits itself as the embodiment of African tradition, but is an imagined cultural practice from the diaspora, rather than a replication of something from any particular traditional African context. Indeed, Kwanzaa is also being practiced on the African continent and many other parts of the African diaspora. Finally, we have the contradiction of intervention versus reinvention, traveling back to the African continent versus affirming the space of the African diaspora as African space. Now, maybe the trip to the African continent for an African American is symbolically as important as a Muslim making the Hajj to Mecca. You know, people get off the plane sometimes and jump down on the ground and kiss the earth. You know, it's a deep moment. I'm saying that because I had that moment. You know, maybe some of you all had that moment. It is the simultaneous affirmation of a particular and a universal. The experience of societies, at least on the surface, run by black people giving freedom and self-determination concrete examples, while at the same time forcing the realization that African Americans are part of the African diaspora and a unique particularity unto themselves as well. There's a long history of black geographically based communities taking on names that connect with Africa. For example, renaming the Black Belt the Republic of New Africa, or renaming neighborhoods Africatown in Mobile, Alabama, or Seattle, Washington, or East Palo Alto, California, near Stanford, as Nairobi, and in such places fashioning programs to implement self-determination for a journey to freedom. So in sum, we have tried to unpack the concept of return. There's been the objectivity of retaining Africanness while subjectively not remembering that one is doing so, of replicating and imagining Africa, as well as intervening on the Africa continent and reinventing Africa elsewhere in the space of the African diaspora. In sum, return to the past has to be linked to a future that we are creating anew. Now to the particularity of Chicago's Africa. We want to use three concepts to map this experience, given the dialectical contradictions of return. These concepts are not mutually exclusive. Identity, scholarship, and politics are often combined in the life experiences of the people I will mention, but for the sake of analytical clarity, I will discuss them separately. By identity here, I mean one's lived experience in everyday life or in some form of cultural representation. By scholarship, I mean formal academic research-based scholarship. And by politics, I mean the organization of forces to fight for change. Now, these people that I will mention are leaders, but they are not alone, as there are many who deserve to be mentioned. So I'm going to mention a few. You all know others. And so in the course of the conversation, we need to represent. So I want you all to raise up the people you know who are in Chicago that represent the connection that we're trying to discuss today. Now, identity involves an informed consciousness, fueled by a flow of information. Now, this brother, known to us as Hammurabi, named Frederick Robb, was a bibliophile extraordinaire, serving in Chicago with material he gathered from all over the world. After a law degree from Northwestern University, he began a journey based on books, those he obtained and those he published. He worked in Chicago like the public historian J.A. Rogers did in New York, as a public intellectual based in and serving the community. Now here you see one of his business cards. Now, this photo here is a deep documentation of how, back in the day, before black bookstores, they used to distribute this material. Now, this is a hair beauty shop, and this is Hammurabi's material that was being sold. Now, it's very important. You see this brother dressed in white. This is the symbolic color of the Nigerian Orisha, Obatala. This is a deep thing. You see black people walking around with white. They represent something they don't even know. This is Obatala. The Nigerians would recognize this. The Cubans would recognize this. We do it and don't know we're doing it. I know y'all can feel me on this if you know something about black people. Where was I? Yeah, I'm talking about these words I got here. Okay, I met Hammurabi in the 1960s as a bookseller when I was a graduate student here at this University of Chicago during the Black Studies program at the Abraham Lincoln Center called the Communiversity. We found out that much of the education we were seeking was to be found not on campus but in the community. Catherine Dunham studied here at the University of Chicago as well and became part of that campus community dialectic. She studied with Robert Redfield, Radcliffe Brown, Edward Sapir, Bronislaw Malinowski. She also studied at Northwestern with Melville Herskovitz. She used the methods of anthropology to explore the dances of the African diaspora, Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad, Tobago, Brazil, among many others. She explored the ritual motion of the religious experience, especially the voodoo of Haiti. She was a founder of the first professional dance company of African Americans and eventually became the dance director of the Chicago Negro Theater Unit of the Federal Theater Project of the WPA here in Chicago. While she explored the traditions of black dance, she used her formal training in anthropology and ballet to invent a new technique approach to dance that came to be called the Dunham Technique. Chicago-born and trained with a global experience of the highest order, she returned to the United States to teach in the inner city of East St. Louis. Ms. Dunham defined dance in the African diaspora for over 70 years, beginning in the 1930s. Another great example from the Chicago community is Marion Perkins, the greatest sculptor of Black Chicago. He was a working-class cultural worker who never stopped his day job, but always found time to make art. He is the epitome of the Chicago-based working-class artist who explored his environment for materials, to make art on its time off, supported by his wife. And that's an example of his work titled Man of Sorrows. Now, he gave the keynote address to the founding conference of the National Conference of Black Artists and ended with these words about Africa. Quote, "It is time that we should begin to drink at the fountain of African culture in order to better know our brother. It is the hope that we can establish a cultural link with rising Africa, and that we darker people marching toward the goal of freedom will trample in the dust the legacy of arrogant superiority, prejudice, and race hate by certain exponents in the Western world." You may know Eugenie Perkins, who's a writer and a poet here, the son of Marion Perkins. Now, at the center of what I'm calling identity for Chicago's Africa is Margaret Burroughs. She was so many things: a painter, a poet, builder of institutions, educator, civic leader, and great friend of Africa. She was an iconic figure of the cultural life of Black Chicago, having been a founder and leading activist for two key institutions: the Southside Community Arts Center, founded as part of the WPA, and currently in the United States, the only existing institution from them exists here in Chicago, Southside Community Arts Center, and the DuSable Museum of African American History and Culture, which has anchored the study of Black history for several generations. In addition, for decades, she was head of the art department at DuSable High School. All of this comes together in her impact on the power of Black consciousness in Chicago, in her important poem, "What Shall I Tell My Children Who Are Black?" And after detailing the problems, she ends with these words: "He will and must survive. I have drunk deeply of late from the fountain of my Black culture, sat at the knee of and learned from Mother Africa, discovered the truth of my heritage, the truth so often obscured and omitted, and I find that I have much to say to my Black children. I will lift up their heads in proud Blackness with the story of their fathers and their fathers' fathers, and I shall take them into the way back time of kings and queens who ruled the Nile and measured the stars and discovered the laws of mathematics. I will tell them of Black people upon whose backs have been built the wealth of 3 continents. I will tell him this and more, and knowledge of his heritage shall be his weapon and his armor. It will make him strong enough to win any battle he may face. And since this story is so often obscured, I must sacrifice to find it for my children, even as I sacrifice to feed, clothe, and shelter them. So this I will do for them if I love them, for none will do it for me." And now scholarship. One of the great scholars who demonstrated the retention of Africa in the diaspora was Lorenzo Turner, anthropologist and linguist. The prevailing racist mainstream scientific point of view was that this strange speech behavior of Africans in America demonstrated their limited mental capacity to grasp and understand European languages. But these scholars themselves were ignorant of African languages. So they had no real scientific basis to justify their racist and demeaning point of view. Turner was the first to begin with knowledge of African languages and learn the patterns of creolization in the language behavior of these Black people torn from their organic home. His work is a foundational study of African American language behavior. He was generous with his time and carried his tape recorder around the city to lecture to community groups and share the linguistic heritage of the African diaspora. Now, I met him on the IC platform while I was a graduate student. He was this elegant gentleman in a three-piece suit, sat down next to me. He had a leather-bound volume. And me, typical University of Chicago graduate student, the big ego, thinking I knew everything. I said, could I see that book? And he handed it to me, and I opened it up, and it was Lorenzo Turner. It blew my mind, and then he told me all kinds of anecdotes as we rode together downtown. Fabulous. He was part of the epic battle of ideas over African retentions. On the one side was Lorenzo Turner and Melville Herskovits arguing for African retention. On the other side was E. Franklin Frazier and Robert Park arguing for a break in behavior and consciousness, how of a tabula rasa. In other words, black people had a blank slate. So this was a debate that went on in scholarly circles. A second scholar, also on the faculty of Roosevelt University at the time, was St. Clair Drake, social scientist of the African diaspora. Both Turner and Drake got their PhD degrees from the University of Chicago, too. Drake was born into the ideological whirlwind of the African diaspora, as his father, born in Barbados, was an international organizer for Garvey's UNIA. Now, after Ghana got its independence, Kwame Nkrumah invited Drake to Ghana to establish the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana. He subsequently worked at Roosevelt University for 23 years before leaving to set up the Black Studies program at Stanford University. He was a master teacher and advocate for the academic excellence and social responsibility in all parts of the African diaspora. Of course, all of the individuals I have included so far have been political. In fact, their orientation to Africa was part of their affirmation of self and community against the savagery of racism. In Chicago, this is personified in the great political activist Ishmael Flory. From his student days, he was a militant activist, including being thrown out of Fisk University for leading a demonstration against the local lynching. He became the leading African-American militant cadre of the Communist Party in Illinois. In that capacity, he mentored a whole generation of revolutionary-minded young people, anchoring them in the science of Marxism-Leninism, as well as the historical struggles of black people in the United States and throughout the African diaspora. Ish was a constant agitator and a friend to anyone willing to fight back against any form of exploitation and oppression. Now, political change has also been the intention of educational efforts. This has certainly been the case with the great Chicago educator, Christine Johnson. Now, Ms. Johnson was the principal of the School of the Nation of Islam in Chicago, the University of Islam it was called. It really was an elementary and high school. This slide shows the textbook she wrote for the children there attending the first grade. Her worldview was informed by her focus on Africans and the African diaspora. She wrote this primer on Africa for a general audience. Note this was an act of self-determination as she published the text herself and personally saw to its distribution. She was particularly close to Malcolm X. When he left the Nation of Islam, she moved on as well. Now, Africa and the African diaspora began a new stage of history when Ghana got its independence in 1957. This is Kwame Nkrumah. The light of freedom began to change the way the world looked upon the so-called dark continent. For African Americans, it was a burst of sunlight, a paradigm shift that made it possible to link the fight against colonialism with the fight in the United States for democratic rights. The history of Pan-African visioning was blooming in the consciousness of black people throughout the African diaspora. The Eurocentric lies about Africa could now be rebutted. Kwame Nkrumah was known to black people in the United States as he had lived, worked, and studied here, matriculating at Lincoln University under the presidency of Horace Mann Bond, Julian Bond's father. He was also a close associate of W.B. Du Bois and George Padmore, especially coming out of the 1945 Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. After Ghana's independence in 1957, Nkrumah became the freedom icon for all of Africa, leading to the formation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. Ghana got its independence in 1957, and the very next year, 1958, he came to Chicago. The black community was organized to welcome Nkrumah, to send the message that the African diaspora was conscious that freedom and independence on the continent was shared by Africans at home and abroad. These children were bold and brave in making this statement. We can only imagine, this is 58, we can only imagine what impact this had on them and how their lives turned out as they came of age in the powerfully significant 1960s. You remember I said Christine Johnson. Now, Christine Johnson was a Pan-Africanist of the highest order. She had befriended Nkrumah well before the 1957 Ghana independence. As these photos demonstrate, she was with Nkrumah in Chicago on the right, and after the coup in Ghana, came to visit him in Guinea, Conakry, where Sékou Touré had given Nkrumah refuge and embraced his leadership by making him honorary co-president of Guinea. A demonstration of the political unity that undergirded the survival struggle is this slide. Christine Johnson, affiliated with the Nation of Islam, here is with Ishmael Flory of the Communist Party, a demonstration of how black people have always been fundamentally united in black identity and the politics of the freedom struggle, united at least by a desire for freedom, if not always aligned on tactical action. The African Heritage Association, Christine Johnson was the president, Ishmael Flory was the executive director, was a leading organization in keeping the black community of Chicago connected to the African freedom struggle. This has been the background, identity, scholarship, and political struggle. Of course, this continues today. A critical moment of change was the first African Liberation Day in 1972. This is a slide of the demonstration in Washington in 1974. Chicago was a major part of this national movement. But here in Chicago, we proclaimed our freedom impulse by electing Harold Washington, mayor of the city in 1983. I remember I was in Paris talking to some expatriate Italian communists, of varying ages. And one of the younger people went up to this old guy who was sitting in a corner, and I'm standing there, and he said, "What's the most important thing in the world?" And he looked up at me and he said, "The election of Harold Washington." That was a moment, I could do. Now till today, the current moment, the current environment. Africa was not only important before white people invaded, it was also important before there were white people. At the cultural and civilization level, this points to the ancient Egypt, even after European plunder and Napoleon's great sin of monumental defacement of the Sphinx. Reaffirming African roots in Egypt has been part of the battle of ideas against the Eurocentric argument that the best of human civilization rests on the advances of Greece and Rome. The Center for Intercity Studies has been one of the institutional advocates for the importance of ancient Egypt. Here are three key people, Jacob Carruthers, Conrad Worrell, and Anderson Thompson, that have been making this case by arranging study tours, taking people from Chicago to visit the archaeological wealth of ancient Egypt. The other major linkage with Africa is the refutation of the lies of colonialism, the lies that demean traditional Africa, the lies that rationalized and justified the excessive violence and cultural hegemony forced on Africa by the European invaders. Darlene is a daughter of Africa who practiced the Sankofa principle of going back to get what one needs from the past, as she traveled to Africa and immersed herself in the traditional cultures of dance. She made the geographical return and made the cultural return to dance. She was able to stimulate dance as a professional art form, as well as to use dance to socialize young people with the discipline of body motion and a healthy self-concept rooted in a positive black identity. Connected to this is the way of the drum, that the drum has always been part of Chicago's musical and religious experience. Traditional African drums came alive with the Sun Drummers, with Art Turk Burton and AACM, with Khalil El-Zabar, who you heard earlier. A lot of people are playing drums. You go to the park, you see the drum circles. The drum has been constant in African American cultural practice. Literature, especially storytelling, and using language to interpret experience in poetry is key to all cultures. Now, these two people have been a great resource for Chicago and beyond. Poet Fuller saw his life's meaning by doing the expatriate move to both Europe and Africa. He found much to absorb and learn from both places, but he also found much to oppose and resist. But what did happen is that he became fixed on the imperative of a Pan-African vision of the world. Hoyt was a fixture in Africa as the 1960s media capital of African Americans. The Defender newspaper, Johnson Publication with Jet and Ebony, Muhammad Speaks, a network of community newspapers, WVON. There were a lot of different ways that Chicago was a media capital of the United States, for black people in the United States in the 1960s. I know some people on those coasts might have difficulty with that, but you know, we have to represent. He edited the leading journal of the Black Arts Movement, first the Negro Digest that then was renamed the Black World. Now Sterling Plump, and I have to point out that brother sitting right there, Sterling Plump. Sterling Plump, that's right, give him a applause. Sterling Plump is our greatest blues poet, combining his rural Mississippi roots with the up-south blues culture of Chicago. We taught together at the University of Illinois. He was blues and I was jazz, and we talked a lot. Sterling made a connection with the African continent through the connection between politics and art. He was connected to the South African situation through writers such as Willie Kotsili and Mongani Sarote, poets and militants of the African National Congress. He edited this collection of South African writers, Somehow We Survived. Combining trips to South Africa and constant communication with his network of writers, he has been a powerful advocate of Pan-African connections. Now, the affirmation of the past, both ancient Africa and traditional Africa, is the basis on which Chicago has affirmed and engaged in the struggle to free Africa from its European colonial bondage. After the breakthrough of Ghana, the fight intensified into various forms of African nationalism and armed struggle in the fight for national liberation. Chicago was involved in moral and material support, not only from afar, but right there up in it. Now here's a case of Mozambique. The leading organization was the Mozambican Liberation Front, Frelimo, founded in 1962. Frelimo's founding president, brother on the right there, was Eduardo Mondlane. Here, at one of his commencements, he had come to the United States for college. He got his undergraduate degree at Oberlin in Ohio, and then graduate study here in the Chicago area at Northwestern for an MA and a PhD. Went on to teach at Syracuse and then went back to lead Frelimo. Now, Prexy Nesbitt, again born and raised in Chicago, was active in the fight for African liberation. Now, this is what the History Makers website says about it, and I quote, "Even before completing his PhD in 1975, Nesbitt was highly active in labor and equality movements. By 1976, he had become the national coordinator and field organizer for the bank withdrawal campaign of the American Committee on Africa. 2 years later, Nesbitt was named the director of the African Project at the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. In 1979, Nesbitt became the program director and secretary of research at the World Council of Churches based in Geneva, Switzerland. Nesbitt returned to Chicago in 1984, where he continued his work as a labor organizer. In 1986, Chicago Mayor Harold Washington named Nesbitt as a special assistant. The following year, the government of Mozambique appointed Nesbitt to serve as a consultant to help them represent their interests to the United States, Canada, and Europe. He remained in the post until 1992. I ain't gonna say a lot about this, but that AK-47 right there has also something to do with the role he played in the continent. Now the case of South Africa, Azania. Chicago was a major contributor to the global struggle against the apartheid regime of South Africa and the liberation of Nelson Mandela. This struggle was at the heart of any discussion of Africa's future. Now, one person who answered the call was Harold Rogers, also educated here at this university. This is what the History Makers site says about Harold. Throughout his life, Rogers has been a politically active person. He served as a labor advisor for the state of Illinois for a number of years. From 1987 to 1992, he worked as a district administrator for Congressman Charles Hayes, who incidentally was the first trade unionist elected to Congress. Black man, south side of Chicago. Rogers has been involved as well in numerous progressive organizations such as the Black Panther Party, the NAACP, and Operation Push. He also served as the executive board member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists since 1975. Rogers' political career has been international in scope. From 1972 to 1993, that's 21 years, he was a Chicago spokesperson for the African National Congress of South Africa, the ANC. He was instrumental in bringing Nelson Mandela to Chicago in 1993 and helped raise funds for Mandela's election the following April. Rogers participated in the U.S. delegation in South Africa's first democratic election. Now, the most profound aspect of Chicago's Africa is certainly connected to the battle of ideas over ancient origins and the value of traditional culture, and is an expression of the fight for freedom and the liberation of African peoples based on their human and democratic right to self-determination. But it is also something new, something reaching for a future that has never been. Chicago has included forces expressing something new, something from new Africans, really expressing their identity as deep probes into the West, the deepest probes into the West with an African sensibility. I am calling this an improvisational reconnection, contributing the particularity of the experience of the African in America, and it is precisely our newness that has excited and thrilled Africa and all of the African diaspora. This is most forcefully demonstrated as conscious acts of cultural innovation in the arts, beginning with the music. Now here we have the musical origin. The discipline of Captain Dyer, who ran the music program at DuSable High School, band leader. He was a military man, a disciplinarian, just like Du Bois. Du Bois used to like his classroom. If you got there late, you couldn't come. You know, Negro today wouldn't understand that. Captain Dyer was a disciplinarian, but it was Sun Ra who unleashed people to explore their imaginary trips way, way out of the box. People left Captain Diet, like Joseph Jarman, and followed Sun Ra into that freedom and that exploration. Sun Ra's space was far removed from any historically specific form of repression or exploitation and took Africanity as a mothership for all of humanity out into space. What he used to say is, space is the place. Now, music has always been foundational to the so-called African-inspired Black Arts movement in Chicago and had its foundation in the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. Now here on the left, the pianist, composer, band leader on the left is Muhal Richard Abrams. one of the founders and key leaders of the AACM. His band laid the concept for how the AACM members would go on to create global music history, as documented in the book, A Power Stronger Than Itself. Again, a trombone player, George Lewis, who's also an academic scholar. The CD in the middle is from the Art Ensemble of Chicago, one of the premier groups of the AACM. They embraced all the musical instruments. When you go to a concert, they might have 50 different instruments on the platform. They embraced African cultural influences on their way to 21st century innovation of what they call great black music or black classical music. The AACM was the epitome of self-determination and continue to do so now in their third generation, reaching to global heights. The AACM continues to base itself in the community and offer classes to young people, always keeping the music alive and always making freedom and self-expression the heart of the matter. A singular person, also a founder of the AACM, was Keelan Phil Karam. One of his creative acts was to hack the traditional African thumb piano with the magic of African-American improvisation to use amplification, electrical, to create a new instrument that he called the francophone. Karam founded the Afro Arts Theater, Afro spelled with two F's, one of the F's representing from. That's the beautiful thing about improvisation and the African-American experience. We're constantly creating something new. It's that creation of something new that is at the heart of the matter, not a norm or a canon or something fixed. What was fixed is to be in the flow and to feel the rhythm of the change. At the same level of excellence, meaning the combination of technique and aesthetics rooted in the self-determination impulse for freedom, was the art collective Afri Cobra. Now, OBASI, the Organization of Black American Culture, was one of the main organizational initiatives of the Chicago Black Arts Movement. 1967, its Visual Arts Workshop created the Wall of Respect, a world event that was replicated 1,500 times throughout the country and the African diaspora. The OBASI leadership from Chicago went on to lead the American delegation to FESHDAC in 1977, Hoyt Fuller, Jeff Donaldson. After the Wall, some of the artists created Afri Cobra and began to creatively improvise a new aesthetic. And this is how they explain their aesthetic. Quote, the aesthetic principles. These principles were not only drawn from the work of the artists in the group, but were also drawn from our inheritable art forms as an African people. One, free symmetry, the use of syncopated rhythmic repetition which constantly changes in color, texture, shapes, forms, patterns, movements, features. Two, mimesis at midpoint, design which marks the spot where the real and the unreal, the objective and the non-objective, the plus and the minus meet. Point exactly between absolute abstraction and absolute naturalism. Three, visibility. Clarity of form and line based on the interesting irregularity one senses in a freely drawn circle of organic object. The feeling for movement, growth, changes, and human touch. Four, luminosity or shine. Literal and figurative as seen in the dress and personal groomings of shoes, hair, processed and natural, and afro. Laminated furniture, face, knees, or skin. And five, finally, color. Kool-Aid color, they call it. Bright colors with sensibility and harmony. Perhaps the best summation of Chicago's Africa is how the new aesthetic has been embraced in everyday life. Clothes, hair, body adornment, and the environments for our homes and offices. Key people like Bob Page of Chicago led the new designers. But a master of design was Chicago's own Ni Oti. Here you see his work. He partnered with Zika Dwinfo, or we knew him as Norbert then, in the store Zambezi on 71st Street, in which they sold their jewelry and other art objects. He was a great influence on the aesthetic projection of the annual African Arts Festival here in Chicago every fall. Now, what can I say to wrap this up? Like the AACM says, we are ancient to the future. We have to be conscious of history and how those of us here right now are really the ancients to the future. That means responsibility to be conscious of how we are helping to design the future. And that, of course, means a legacy we leave for the children. I guess in my rethinking of the concept of return, the central theme for this conference, I have to say that what is new in the 21st century is that the dynamic is for the entire diaspora. We are continually discovering what is special, what is beautiful, what is innovative about each of our particularities in every corner of the African diaspora. Of course, we look to Africa as a universal source, but the economic and political realities of each particular case of survival in the African diaspora force us to face a crisis beyond what we could have imagined back in '57 when Ghana got its independence, or in '65 when the civil rights movement here was making democratic gains. I guess we can do no better than remember the words of Margaret Walker, again another great Chicagoan. Let a new earth rise, let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and a strength of final clenching be this pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men and women now rise and take control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matt. So many questions. One of the reasons why we wanted to start this conference with this conversation and with this talk is through the dialogues that we've been having with many Chicagoans over the last year or so. It quickly became clear that we needed to map the history of Chicago's connection to the continent. And to think about the conversations that we're going to have now and potentially in the future about contemporary connections within a sort of historical lineage. And I think you so beautifully kind of drew that line for us. I guess one of my first questions, as a child of the diaspora, and having arrived here in Chicago over 2 years ago, is thinking about the connections of the African American community here on the south side of Chicago with the immigrant African newcomers, as it were. And could you talk about that sort of living side by side and how the two communities interact and intersect with each other?
Sure. Yes, what an interesting question. Because class reality, transportation technology is such that there are different kind of migratory patterns than have historically existed. Particularly given the economic crisis on the continent and the economic crisis in the Caribbean, that helps to determine what kind of migration is existing here. Everybody doesn't come. You got to be able to buy a plane ticket. You have to be able to aspire to have your kids grow up in a different environment. You have to be able to go to graduate school here and stay here. There are all kinds of ways that people come here, but there are really 2 or 3 interesting dynamics. One of them is people who leave Africa and come here and have children, their children grow up as African Americans. So there's a contradiction there. And sometimes, for example, they don't have the background, so they may not even speak the language that their grandparents would speak. So you have that contradiction. You also have the contradiction of class. Are we talking about people from the continent who come and get a job, or are we talking about people who come and invest and become entrepreneurs and maybe own businesses? And so you take on a class character. So there's culture and there's class. And those dynamics
really determine relationships. But I think that the interesting thing is the extent to which, I mean, I've had both positive and negative experiences, just to be absolutely frank. There are African elites, for example. I've had people point to me and say, you've been a slave, we haven't been slaves. You know, so there's that kind of dynamic that goes on. On the other hand, I have had the dominant experience for the majority of Africans is a joyful connection to the African American experience. So what I want to say is that it's a dynamic experience. But there's also this question of the extent to which people live in closed communities. Sometimes African Americans can be closed, sometimes Africans can be closed. So we're really experiencing a new moment of global connection. Chicago is not the East Coast. East Coast is different. Like in Washington, D.C., you have a large number of Ethiopians. And there are certain places in the country where people from the continent have gathered, so the African community takes on that character. There are communities which are mainly Somali, and so on. So that is also a factor. But it's a very dynamic thing. It really is. And I would certainly know that you all have had some experiences, and I want to encourage you all to join this conversation, because I'm certainly no absolute authority on these matters.
I guess my question was because I was interested if there were figures who came from the continent and who embedded themselves in the African American community and transferred knowledge through kind of a sort of one-to-one relationship.
Well, in Chicago, in terms of the African freedom movement, there was a brother from Zimbabwe whose name was Rua Chiri.
Yes.
And Rua was very important in terms of understanding that there was a global struggle, and that just as he was helping us understand the struggle in Zimbabwe and in Southern Africa, he was involved in our struggle here. So that connection was really important. I also think that the whole question of repatriation is interesting, because we think of it as movements, and we think of it as sort of famous names. But I remember going to the projects, like Robert Taylor Holmes, in Monrovia, Liberia. And I'm sitting down playing checkers with the dude. And the brother walks up and sits down, and he was from Detroit. He just moved to Liberia. It wasn't no this and that. He had just made the move. And so there's emotion on the ground that's way more powerful than we even understand. Because a lot of people just got a ticket and went on, didn't make a whole lot about it. Now Garvey made a lot about it. I mean, that boat didn't probably make it, but anyway, the point is that a lot of people, made the connection. So Rua Chiri is a name. I think also the role that Northwestern played. A lot of Africans from the continent came through Northwestern, more than the University of Chicago. And so there was that connection that we had with them. But that Rua Chiri is really the name that stands out to me as a brother who has really made a connection with us in the 1960s.
Anybody from the art world, from the cultural scene?
Well, there were a lot of people that moved through, like Willie Kotsitsili was somebody. And I met Willie in North Carolina, and he was active with the Malcolm X Liberation University. But when we opened our bookstore, 21st Century Books, on 43rd Street, the initial cultural program was Willie Kotsitsili. Then certain African musicians came through. But I can't think of anyone who, from the continent, who was here. I don't know, Sterling or Floyd or somebody, Bennett, maybe you could think of somebody.
Abdullah Kamara, who was a dancer, came here and came here and lived here and was instrumental in Montu's development.
That's right.
So there was almost an unending flow of dancers who came and lived with us and danced with us, especially in the early stages. The Getty Ballet, it was as if every company that came lost a member because they would stay here with us.
Yeah.
Dennis Bruce was a professor at Northwestern
Give him the mic.
from 1967, 66, and then there was a Zimbabwean poet, Ruwa Chiri, who was also perhaps connected with Senegalese in 67.
Dennis Bruce is very important in terms of, as an expatriate South African writer who really brought the experience not only of the South African writers, but the African continent writers to us. You know. And see, again, he was involved in the struggle. He was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. So in other words, what I'm saying is that you had cultural identity, and then you had the politics of freedom. And that really is the main theme, is this question of the path to freedom, the road to freedom. And that's why today is so important, because there's no clear path. See, when the Europeans were in control, it was clear. Get rid of these invaders. But that is a little bit more ambiguous now. So we now have that new concept called Afro-pessimism. In other words, the idea that there is confusion, there's disorientation, that people we had hope for and with, like Mugabe, has not worked out. And so we see what was righteous being turned into something else, and we have now a struggle. Just like here, we thought that having black people in office, was going to free us. We've gone all the way to the top, and we ain't free. And again, Chicago's responsible. But, we have a situation. So, but what's really interesting about that is we are now free to think for ourselves something new, but that's a responsibility. You can't be ignorant. People used to say, wear ignorance almost like a badge. Well, I went to a daily school. But ignorant is not a badge. We need intelligence. We need people to read and write. That's why the crisis in the school is so important. The kids don't understand that. Everybody who grew up in Chicago during the industrial period knew the value of education, knew the value of discipline. When did you go to bed? Depending on what shift your people were working on. You had to be quiet when people were asleep because they had to get up to go to work. Well, today, if nobody's working and everybody's watching TV, the ignorant box, what are we going to do? So we need discipline. We need a new way of defining what the road to freedom is. That's a responsibility that's new. It's not based on jobs. Ain't no packing house anymore. Railroad, post office, that's replaced by UPS. And, this is where black people used to work.
Thank you. I wonder maybe we can open it up to folks if anyone had any questions or thoughts, and just watch for the mic.
Thanks for that. One of the reasons I came, at the risk of saying something provocative, it seems like an event like this, where we're talking about Pan-Africanism, is about the only place in Chicago where you can come to an event like this and it doesn't begin and end with a prayer session. Okay, and notice that you did not mention any faith-based organizations. Okay? Can you speak to that a little bit and talk about whether or not, at the present time, we are being well served by these faith-based organizations, and whether or not we need to have maybe a re-infusion of the type of just discussion that we've had tonight that is kind of devoid of that orientation?
What you've raised is almost the heart of the matter. That is to say that black people are a religious people. We know this. And it is a weakness of this kind of event. It didn't start with prayer, right? Because look who's here. If this was a based audience in the black community, it would have required a prayer. Now, when you start talking about ministers, you know, we can say Al Sampson, John Porter. These are ministers from Chicago that were active in the movement, and they were active in helping people understand that Jesus was from Africa. What does it say in the Bible? You know, so there's a tradition there of consciousness and identity that has been part of the movement, part of the story. The interesting thing about revolutionary consciousness in this country is that it is often idealist. People like to make revolution in books and on the blackboard and in conversations, and not with the people. Because when you go with the people, you have to accept the reality of who and what they are and build from there. And so in our community, it's when the church moved in the civil rights movement, and when the people started singing in the movement, that spirit power was the basis on which we could not be defeated. When we sing again, when we represent the values of the historic journey that has served us since slavery, we will once again have the kind of powerful movement. Now it's the same thing in Africa. The South African movement, they sang and they danced. What's the name of that dance? The Toy Toy. You know what I mean? They were dancing. The Native Americans, the Lakota people, they did what? The ghost dance. These religious people just started dancing. It went all the way to Washington, D.C. Obasi, paint the wall, all the way to City Hall. So culture, and particularly in relation to the church, because what else do we have? That is the basis on which we are going to move as a people if we're going to move. And to me, like last night, I was at Stone Temple on 3600 block of Douglas Boulevard on the west side of Chicago. This really blew my mind because I used to live at 3608 West Douglas Boulevard, right on that same block. The Poor People's Campaign, being led by Reverend Barber of the Moral Monday movement coming out of North Carolina, was there. It was packed. Had 500 plus people there. And they were singing and praying and talking war talk. This spring, in 37 states, there are going to be demonstrations at the state capitals, including right here in Illinois, of people coming up out of poverty, the homeless, the people who are paying less than $15 an hour, the people who live in environmental struggles, etc. Now, what we need to do is to bring the consciousness of the global struggle that can come forward in the discussion of Pan-Africanism and link it up with that class-based struggle to transform this country. That connection, the class and black consciousness and Latino consciousness and indigenous people's consciousness, when those things connect, then suddenly even poor white people begin to understand that their future is not based upon an alliance with generals and billionaires. So we have an interesting possibility here. So I've been talking about the negative aspect, but the flip side of that is the tremendous possibilities that exist now, if we can only understand and rise to the occasion.
How do you root it? I mean, I think over the course of the next couple of days, we're going to see different versions of what Pan-Africanism was for different parts of the diaspora, as a reality, as a utopian ideal, as a failure. And I'm just wondering how, for you at least, what is the current status of Pan-Africanist thought? And how do you root that possibility in this sort of historical movement?
Well, first of all, I would never call Pan-Africanism a failure. The Sylvester Williams, at the turn of the century, had an idea about Africa. The idea of Africa as an abstraction comes from people who are outside of Africa. People in Africa were thinking about, I am this, in this local place. They weren't thinking about the continent of Africa. The only people thinking about the continent of Africa is people who were not in Africa. And didn't know nothing about what was up in Africa in the first place. So every stage of the Pan-African movement, up until, through Du Bois, etc., to 1945, what happened? The people of 1945 went back and liberated their countries. That was a Pan-African thing. That's no failure. That was independence. That's number one. Number two is the nationalist movement, or African nationalism. African National Congress. Zimbabwe African National Union. These were people who saw themselves as part of a continental struggle for freedom. That is not a failure. Nkrumah was not a failure. Nkrumah had, check this out, they built a dam called the Akasambo Dam. It was very important because of providing electricity. And like Lenin said, electricity is communism. Electricity is the future. With the digital age, everybody ought to understand that. No electricity, no computer. Then he built a home on the cliff above the Akasambo Dam. And he used to bring African leaders to that, and they had a big porch, a wraparound porch. And they looked down on the dam, and he'd be talking to them about the unification of Africa based on these ideas about economy and so on. Simultaneous with that, he had camps in the country training revolutionary guerrillas to overthrow the dudes he was talking to on the veranda. In other words, he was trying to play the countries to move in a progressive way. Step one. Step two was the people who were going to reorganize from below to make sure the workers and peasants would actually be able to run and impose their will on the society in the future, knowing the bourgeois would be hypocrites and turncoats anyway. Today, South Africa has this notion of an Africa Renaissance. Again, an idea, a claim, a challenge, a call to have a new vision beyond Afro-pessimism. So it seems to me that Pan-Africanism has always been for each generation a hope, a guide to the future. It's just like in this country, we have to reestablish the absolute essential character of not only black unity, but to understand our connection to the Caribbean, to Latin America, and incidentally to countries we don't identify with the African diaspora. Mexico, all up and down Middle America. In other words, Chinese ain't the only people been everywhere. You know what I mean? Black people everywhere. And so that means that we have then an international consciousness. The right wing in this country have always thought black people were subversive. Why? Because we had a connection to the world. We were the part of the progressive force. I mean, even a conservative black man was thought to be dangerous. That's why in the 60s we always said what? Every Negro is a potential black man.
Tosha, can you pass this on?
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the generational possibilities of Pan-Africanism. I'm very ignorant of this, but two things that I'm aware of in relation to South Africa today. First is the student movement for decolonization, which shows strong continuities to the ethos of the anti-apartheid struggle, but also has strong breaks with it. So there is a certain kind of discourse of Mandela was a sellout because he compromised with the white regime and so on. And so that's one axis of complication. And the other one is the rise of nationalist xenophobia in places like South Africa against migrant workers and so on, that interrupts the possibility of a Pan-African consciousness. And both of these seem to be a function of a certain kind of generational moment. And so how does one think of these possibilities out of this generation?
Thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right about using the concept of generation, because that point about Mandela being a sellout, it's a very interesting question. Now here you are, an old dude in prison, and they come to you and they say, let's make a deal. You come on out. There's certain things you can do, certain things you can't do. They even took him out of prison and drove him around. And he's sitting there in the car. The guy gets out of the car and goes in to buy some pops. And Mandela's alone in the car looking around. Should I make a break for it? You know what I mean? Or they have something, do they have an assassin waiting to shoot me? What would you do? Well, okay, you say, maybe there's 20% chance I can help my people. Would you stay in jail until they said maybe 30% chance? You know? What would you do? I mean, it's an interesting question. You know, a lot of people make a decision. You know, they weren't there. They weren't the one in jail. Okay. So that's an interesting question. The next generation coming sees the result of what the ANC has turned into, what the Communist Party in South Africa has turned into, and reject that. On the basis of ideology, on the basis of class forces and what's really happening in South Africa. The Shack brothers, water, anything you mention. The corruption of officials, money. Yeah, Zuma, I mean, you know, we could go on. Details about that. But the same thing happens in this country. The civil rights movement. We have Jesse Jackson. Forget Jesse, his son. That's a matter of fact. So there are these issues. But one couldn't argue that there was no contribution made by Jesse and by Bush and so on. Breadbasket. It was something that contributed essentially to a growing middle class. So half full, half empty, you know. So anyway, the other point you mentioned.
But xenophobia.
Yes. The economic crisis on the continent, like the crisis of black people here, is so savage and so ultimately dehumanizing that it's almost hard to talk about it. You know, and certainly in polite society. I mean, in a way, why are you always talking about that? You know what I mean? It's just like, I often think, how is it that a black intellectual cannot go postal in a society like this? I mean, it's just absolutely vicious. You know, the man's the president of the United States. You know what I mean? It's just a serious moment here. And African countries, you know, this one throwing all the Ghanaians out, this one throwing all the Zimbabweans out. We have a sister right now who's studying with us, be a librarian. She's from Zimbabwe, you know. She's going back to South Africa, and they were saying, well, why do we have any Zimbabweans in leadership positions? They should go home, you know. So the question is this. If we focus on the contradiction between two victims, we miss the point of understanding what the source of their victimization is. And so the question of Pan-Africanism is to begin to understand the commonality. The essence of Pan-Africanism is common problems, common solutions. And so that's what we have to have. We have to have a deepening of understanding. But where does that understanding come from? The understanding comes from, do you have the basis for going up against the enemy? And when you go up against the enemy, then people find commonality. It's the same with blacks and whites in this country. There, at the surface level, black people don't like white people for a good reason. You know, maybe you're wrong about all of them, but you're mostly right. White people feel like black people are taking their jobs. Every time they see a black person in the job or driving a Cadillac or whatever, they say, that should be mine. But it's only when we fight against the common enemy that the possibility exists. Let America be America again, the land it never has been yet and yet must be. That's Langston, you know. So, I mean, I take your point. This is part of the Afro-pessimism. This is part of the crisis. But I think if you look at South Africa today, the struggle of the shack dwellers is a powerful movement of poor people. It's a poor people's campaign in South Africa. The students rising against the symbols and monuments of the apartheid regime. What's happening in this country? The movement of young people against the symbols of the Confederacy and so on. So we can see elements in both places of the beginnings of a new fight back. And I think that, you know, so we should always look for, as Mao would say, the single sparks that can start a prairie fire. We know the tinder is dry. We know everybody's hurting. We know a lot of intellectuals are self-serving, greedy, de-linked idealists, even when they talk about the struggle. They will only wake up, those of us speaking in this conference, I don't want to put you all under any pressure, but I'm just saying, we will become more relevant when the people begin to move. And that's true everywhere in the world.
Maybe we can have 2 more questions. I'm going to go for the gentleman in the back.
You mentioned earlier that we have connections to the Caribbean, Mexico, and recently in the wake of the devastating hurricanes that they've had in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, I have had feelings that have just kind of devastated me, given the treatment that I see. I would like to know what you see there and what you feel that we as black people can and should try to do about it.
The crisis as a result of these storms in those islands have redefined history in those places. And there's a woman by the name of Naomi Klein who has written about how the ruling class and reactionary forces move in as a result of a crisis. And they make gains to the right, instituting fascism, instituting greater degrees of exploitation. That's what's getting ready to happen in the Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico. They are going to advance privatization, and they're going to subdue the Puerto Rican people to becoming even less than the second-class citizens they are now. I think for us, there are a couple of points that are important. Number one is that we have to confront sort of back to this notion of fratricidal war. We have to confront the reality that there are contradictions between blacks and Latinos. And the reality is that the places like Cuba had more overt connections to the African diaspora in terms of the past than a lot of African Americans. In other words, the religions, the language, etc. The linkage is different, stronger in that sense. So we have to understand that Puerto Ricans are us. You know, they're not somebody else. And I don't mean that in the American citizenship sense. I mean that in the African diaspora sense. And obviously the Virgin Islands. They are facing a problem that we are facing. In other words, Trump, what he's doing toward them, he's also doing toward us. And so looking at then the source of the problem, which is Trump, and we have to figure out how we can best contribute to solving the problem that they have, which is also solving the problem that we have. And we can start with Rahm Emanuel. You know, you got to start at home. And the other thing is that the resources that we have to be used in important ways. And one of the best resources we have is to educate ourselves and to educate the young people. So when people watch TV and they watch it about Puerto Rico, they have to understand we have to be talking to people. That's us. That's our neighborhood. You know, if you don't do that, then you fall into that. Those are Latinos, and they are different from us.
So one final question. I'm going to put 9.
But you have to also get this man's question.
I will do so.
Mine is more a comment, but perhaps also the question. I wanted to go back to the question asked by the first gentleman, and you used the euphemistic term faith-based organizations. But the question as it was phrased and the answers as they came were clearly about the black church, as the examples were at least. And I wanted to complicate this by introducing the black mosque into our discussion. You know, I noticed that in your presentation at the very beginning you talked about the Moorish temple, but without a reference to the fact that that's one of the sources of conversion to Islam. And I think there can be a productive conversation between these two forms of faith and their relationship to the idea of return. First, because one of the parts of the discourse around Islam in America has been about, whether correctly or incorrectly, that this is going back to the religion that at least 30% of the population was prior to conversion, forced conversion to Christianity. That's always one of the arguments of Islam, that it's a return to what we were before. Secondly, part of the argument for the spread of Islam, especially in the 50s and 60s, was also a response to the black church, saying that the church is not doing something that, at least that was the argument of the mosque. And then throughout the 60s and 70s, as the transnational flows happened, of course there were governments and people in Africa, or the idea of Africa, where Christianity could be just as relevant, but there are others where Islam was more relevant in some ways. And there's always been a back and forth between these two faith-based belonging within the African American experience. And I think once we get to the idea of Africa and the return, it gets even more complicated. So I'd like to hear about that, because I think some of those figures were in your presentation, but not spelled out.
Yeah, remember I did talk about the Nation of Islam. And Elijah Muhammad was in Detroit, moved to Chicago. So Chicago was HQ. Now here's what's interesting. Islam was an alternative to the American fascist Ku Klux Klan use of the cross. So in that sense, representing the forces that legitimated slavery. And, but it was also a rejection of Africa. And so Elijah Muhammad would always say, we're from the East. And that was an interesting contradiction. It was Malcolm that brought the African nationalism of Harlem into the conversation. And so it became interesting. But here's the other thing. Muhammad Speaks, which is a newspaper of the Nation of Islam, was always run by a communist. And so you had the centerfold, where you had Elijah Muhammad speaking about the mothership, or, you know, Yaqub, etc. And then you had the food, you know, the bean pies and all of that. But you then had what? We read about Vietnam from dispatches that came from Hanoi. The reason why people read Muhammad Speaks was because it was a freedom newspaper. And so the dynamic, and I can, anyway, the Nation of Islam, that's the whole story about that. But the point is that Islam is not, and for that matter Christianity, is not something that is devoid or divorced from the freedom struggle. Black people, Malcolm taught this, that old-time religion he used to talk about, that was the Old Testament. And he would always criticize people who went to the New Testament, that turn the other cheek Testament. He wanted the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth part of the Bible. So you could look at it a lot of different ways. But here's the point. The movement for change in this country often came out of, and in spite of, the church. Came out of, but often in spite of the leadership of the church. But there's always a crisis with Islam, and it's a crisis today with Islam, in terms of black people's version of Islam in this country. When those brothers got killed in Los Angeles and Malcolm wanted to go to war, Elijah stopped it. And then Malcolm had to say, y'all ought to be thankful you got Elijah Muhammad, because we're getting ready to go to war. Farrakhan, when the debate was going on in Congress about the welfare reform that Clinton was using a Republican strategy to implement his version of what the ruling class wanted in this country, ending welfare as we know it, is what they used to say. While that was going on, Farrakhan organizes a trip to D.C. for atonement, not to attack Congress to stop that cutting off black people from having welfare. So we went to atone. Black people were caught up in that until one moment. And that's when the baskets went around for the fundraising, and Farrakhan said, we now want to announce that we're opening a bank. We want all the black people in the country to give us all your money, put it in our bank. And that's when people, you know, that was the end of it. But my point here is that we haven't yet seen, I mean, other than in small groups, etc., the kind of response from Islam that came from the Christian church and the civil rights movement. On the other hand, in the artist community, since the 40s, there were people who became Islamic who were really the most freedom-oriented people in jazz. Yusef Lateef is one of them. But there were a lot of people like Art Blakey and so on, they all had Muslim names. So, you know, Abdul Al-Khalima, you know. So, you know, it's an interesting question. There are lots of issues here.
We're going to take the final question very quickly.
Yeah. I'm Mohammed Reza. Listen, you indicated that Nkrumah was a key guy in Africa, intelligent, educated in the United States, had integrity, and had a vision for liberating Africa. Can you tell us the role of Franklin Williams in the problem that Nkrumah had?
Now, is this, you always ask me these questions, making me think about people, are you talking about the guy that became the head of the Ford Foundation?
No, Franklin Williams went to school with as Lincoln, with Nkrumah, and he was the leader in the NAACP. And they sent him to Ghana.
This is Bennett Johnson. Yeah. Bennett Johnson is a very important person in the historical development of everything we've been talking about. He is the brother who helped make a connection between Martin Luther King and Elijah Muhammad. He also set up a meeting where, this is interesting in terms of the art thing, is when Jeff Donaldson and I and Bennett went and had a meal with Elijah Muhammad at his crib. And the story I'll tell about that is he ate one meal a day. And he was a very slow, deliberate eater. And we had just gobbled up our food, you know what I mean, like we normally do, you know. And then they would serve coffee. And they had served coffee, and people were just getting ready to order cream and sugar. And when he told this story, he said, look, he said, it's like coffee. You get a cup of coffee, and you start pouring cream in it, and the next thing you know, you can't even taste any coffee. And at that point, the people said, what would you like? He said, we're having our coffee black, thank you. Anyway, there's Ben Johnson.
Well, Frank Williams was a leader in NAACP, went to school with Nkrumah. And so he came over to Ghana to allegedly help Nkrumah run things. And he was sent by the CIA. And of course, he was instrumental in the demise of Nkrumah.
See, this is a question about black people and the state. And it's an interesting question in Africa, it's everywhere in the world. And that is that on an individual level, the question of identity is not something that is independent from the forces of power and money. And so in the civil rights movement, there were people who played roles that were positive, but also for the other side. And this is a very serious question when it comes down to the nature of the state today. And we learned this from the NSA, we learned this from, you know, all these agencies that exist in the world. And again, this is part of that moment. But we were running a community center. We were helping children. And there was a brother named, his sign-on was Pi Squared. He came with his daughter, got involved in the program. And at a certain point, he pulled me aside and he said, look, I'm getting ready to move. We were in Toledo, Ohio then. We're getting ready to move to Cleveland. And I just want to tell you that my background is in Army intelligence. And I just want to tell you that we didn't really understand what you were doing here, but you really helped my daughter. I see what you're doing here, and I wish you well. And then went on. It was rather a sobering thing. But then I remember talking to a dude named Ollie Harrington. I don't know if you know that name. He's a cartoonist. Ollie Harrington. He was an expatriate in Berlin. And I checked him out. I was teaching at the Free University of Berlin, and I checked him out. And so we were talking, and he said, look, this is the McCarthy period. I'm at a bar, my friend comes, we were having drinks, and he said, Ollie, I think you ought to take a vacation. And he said, well, I'll pay for the drinks. And he opened up his wallet, and there was a badge. It was a cow of some kind. And Ollie heard that and looked down, and he said, I gotta go to the bathroom. He got up, went to the bathroom, went out the back door, went straight to the bus station, went to Mexico. And the party in Mexico set him up. Then he moved to Paris and was tight with Richard Wright. And I'll just finish the story. Richard Wright was a hypochondriac. He was always going to the doctor because he thought something was whatever. But he would always tell Ollie when he would go to the American hospital in Paris, saying that they won't do anything if it's publicly known I'm here. Ali takes a trip, comes back, where is Richard? Can't find Richard. Goes to the hospital, oh, Mr. Wright, he died. What? Then suddenly, his wife, being advised by Michelle Fabre, who was teaching African American studies in Paris, advised them not to have an autopsy and to bury the dude right away. Ali writes about all of this. It's his article in Ebony. He's telling me this, right? So then I subsequently have a discussion with Michelle Fabre, who was sent to study African Americans by the French Navy. I'll just let you all make the connections. Anyway, Ali then goes to visit a company to sell some cartoons in Berlin and looks out the window and there's some tanks and they're building the wall. So once again, Ali is stuck and he lives over in East Berlin. But beautiful cat. Beautiful brother. He's the one who invented the cartoon strip Bootsy. Just like Justin B. Simple, Bootsy was a character. And you can look him up, you can Google him and see all his stuff. Beautiful. I got so wrapped up in my story, I don't know what the end of it. You know, just sharing a few thoughts.
Well, that's a fantastic note to end with. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll continue tomorrow bright and early, around 12:30 downstairs in the screening room for a full day of panels and conversations. So I hope you can join us. And also on Sunday we have a screening program at the Rebuild Foundation of 2 films from 2 p.m. So you can also join us for that. Thank you so much and safe drive home, guys.
One last point, I have a few copies of my talk, in case anybody would like to copy.